All right, up to this point, we've looked at federalism sort of, I guess you could say, from a constitutional and a historical aspect, looking at arguably historically the most famous example of the conflict between the federal and state government as it relates to integration of the races, looking at sort of the constitutional imperatives of federalism. Now we turn to a more practical application, I guess you could say, of federalism. And I would argue it's probably the most common application of federalism in the modern era. Now, that's not to say that those constitutional disputes over who decides are no longer relevant. By God, they are. Whether it's we're looking at things like LGBT rights, or we're looking at things like voting rights, there's still a tremendous amount of conflict between when we speak with one voice as an entire nation and when we just have each state make their own discrete calls, for sure. But the biggest aspect of the federal state relationship today, from a strict numbers standpoint, has to do with money. So, we spent our time thus far looking at basic definitions of federalism, a couple key historical examples. Civil rights, by far the biggest one, and the one that should be noted and discussed. After all, it's an entire unit later on, along with civil liberties, in the AP government course sequence. But in the modern era, the most common example, and by common I mean this is something that happens every single year. The fight over civil rights ebbed and flowed and still ebbs and flows to this day. But there's not a new crisis every single year, per se. Although actually there's some, I'm sure, that would dispute that, and they may be able to make a defensible case. But point is, when we talk about the federal budget, that is an institution of federalism, and it's done every single year. So that is what we're going to approach today. So the first thing we want to point out is that this is nothing new. You could go all the way back to the Articles of Confederation, which we talked about not that long ago and pointed out that from a policy standpoint, it was not, this new national government was not ordained with a ton of power to do very much. But one of the things they did do is they encouraged the sale of plots of land within the township system that was created, for example, by the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance of 1785. They said, well, you're going to have these 36 1-acre plots of land, or 1-acre square plots of land, or not 1 acre, I'm sorry, 1 square mile plots of land, these townships. Keep one of those and don't sell it to any private enterprise, just simply keep it and then sell that after the fact, and you can pay for things like colleges and schools and other public services. Schools are not the only one. I should have just put public services here if we're being honest. Schools become a more specific example of financial federalism in the 1860s. One of the things that happens, and this is not an A-push class, so I'm not going to go too long on this. I could honestly go for an hour just on what I'm about to talk to you about. But one of the real revolutions that comes out of the Civil War and comes out of Reconstruction is the notion of community education. And what I mean by that is not that you educate people about your community. No. What I mean is the notion that it is the responsibility of a state, a county, a community, to educate its citizens. And this comes out of the Civil War. Because one of the main things the newly freed slaves wanted in coming out of the war, more even in some cases than land or money, or even economic freedom, although that was obviously a high priority, was the desire to be educated, because that was a particular freedom, a particular right that had been denied to them, forcibly denied to them. It was in some states a criminal offense to educate your slaves in any way, teach them to read or write. Notably, Frederick Douglass's owner's wife breached that and taught him how to read and write, and he became one of the finest writers of his generation, of course, one of the architects of the abolitionist movement. But when Reconstruction begins in 1865, one of the things that comes out of that is the notion that there need to be structural school systems set up to begin the process of educating the newly freed slaves. School systems. like we have today. Understand, we did not have those prior to the Civil War. There was no community school districts. There were private schools all over the place, most of them at the upper levels. To use a modern phrase for it, if anybody was educated at a lower elementary level, by and large, those people were homeschooled. There were some that were educated in private schools, but the idea of a school district, the way we have one today here in Manhattan Beach, no. Didn't really exist. And in many places didn't exist till the 20th century. So, why am I saying all this? Because in the 1960s, as one of the priorities coming into Reconstruction is we have to give the ability to newly freed slaves to learn. We need an educational system put in place to guide that education. Well, a completely expected byproduct of that, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, would be for communities to say, well, we could use education as well, systemically. And that brings us to something called the Morrill Land-Grant Act, named for the senator who proposed it. It might have been actually in the House. The Morrill Land-Grant Act granted government land, because you probably don't know this, or very few of you do, but the single biggest landowner in just about any state in the Union is the federal government. If it has not been bought by private investors, if it is not in the hands of the state or a city or a county, it's federal land. So like over 90% of states like Nevada, Utah, Wyoming are owned by the federal government. Now, back in the 1860s, today a lot of that federal government land is land that the reason it hasn't been sold to anybody is because nobody wants it. Some of it, of course, is set aside for national parks and monuments and historic sites and for environmental or ecological purposes. But a lot of it's just land that nobody wants, quite frankly. But that wasn't true in 1860. The federal government still owned some fine tracts of land. So the Morrill Land-Grant Act granted those lands, especially the more attractive lands, to the states. Said, this is yours now. And you can sell it to whatever private entity wants to buy it. But there's a catch, and the catch is you must take the money that you gain from the sale of the land we are deeding to you, and you must use it to establish colleges. These are what become known as the land-grant colleges. And some of the bigger, more prestigious public colleges in America come out of this Morrill Land-Grant Act. So the point I'm trying to make to you in the outset here is that this notion of financial federalism, which is how I'm going to choose to refer to it, is nothing new. It's been around since before we had a constitution. One of the most profound educational pieces of legislation of the 19th century was built around this idea of federal state relationship. But what really made this relationship take off, because even as late as the turn of the 20th century, so around 1900, the total amount of grants to all of the states combined was less than it would cost to get 1 year out of, Ohtani, the baseball player. It was only about $12 million. By the end of the century, it's going to be closer to $200 or $300 billion. Today, it's closing in on $1 trillion. What changed? Well, we're going to look at that. Two things change. The first thing that changed is the 16th Amendment, the income tax. Now, what the income tax did, in a very basic way, is it provided the government with a lucrative and very flexible source of funding. Now, in the time we're talking about, there were a lot of things calling for that money. This was the height of the Progressive era, so there was a bunch of reforms being put in place. A lot of those reforms cost money. And of course, shortly after the passage of the 16th Amendment, we get World War I. So prior, as I said a little earlier, prior to the income tax, the total dollar amount of federal grants was around $12 million. By 1940, it's over $800 million. So it grows very quickly. Now, not all of this is owed to the income tax. Another big driver of this federal-state relationship, as it revolves to money, the financial federalism I'm referring to here, another big driver of that is actually the Depression and, more to the point, the New Deal. A lot of things happen in that time frame. But one thing that does happen is a change in the American mentality as it related to the federal government. For those who don't remember this from history, or maybe I had a teacher that interpreted it a little differently than I'm about to, which is fine. History is an interpretable science, or art, if you prefer. One of the things about the Great Depression was that one of the criticisms that drove Herbert Hoover to defeat is that he had a national government that could, quote unquote, do something about this crisis and didn't, largely. Eric Rauchway, who is a history professor at UC Davis, one of the foremost experts in the country on the Great Depression, notes, I'll say jokes, but he's not really joking, that a lot of historians try to find a way of saying that Hoover did more about the Depression than most people think. And his thinking is, and again, this is one of the most foremost experts on the Depression and the New Deal, he's like, no, I'm kind of go against everybody else. I think he gets too much credit. I think he's overrated on the subject. And the funny thing about him saying he's overrated is he ain't rated all that high. So you get a change in the American mentality. See, prior to the Depression, no one really thought of the government as a potential source of recovery, of resources. People didn't, to use a phrase, a colloquialism that a lot of conservatives use, they didn't look to the government for help. Of course, the Depression was a crisis unlike none we've ever seen. 25% unemployment, GDP cut by almost half. So by the time Roosevelt gets into office in 1933, one of the things he campaigns on is that the nation cries for action, and action now. His words, not mine. And America was more than ready for that. So one of the reasons why you see that change from 12 million to 800 million is because the public now, by the midpoint of the Depression, and by the rise of the New Deal, the American citizen, the American voter, is now accepting of the concept of government as a source of benefits. Now, it wasn't the first time that Americans were able to view the government that way. It's a revolution that really began, honestly, in the Progressive era, when you see things like the Pure Food and Drug Act, and you see the workplace safety regulations that come in after the Triangle Fire and things like that. The idea of government being sort of an adjudicator between the industrialized world, the business world, and the worker was also somewhat conceptually new, especially after the Gilded Age, when everyone just inherently knew that government was foursquare on the side of business. So there's a change in sort of the mentality of the country. The idea of government as being sort of an intermediary, a provider of relief, a provider of goods, a provider of assistance, is a relatively new concept. So you start to see a spike. The first spike happens during the New Deal. The second spike happens during the Great Society years of Kennedy and Johnson, mostly Johnson. Kennedy is, and if you had me, you probably already, in one of the assignments we worked on, but to the point, Kennedy was not, for all of the adulation that he earned in life and in death, from a policy standpoint, he was not a wickedly successful president. Congress didn't like him. They loved Johnson, and they'd do anything for him pretty much, because either they loved him or they were scared shitless of him, one or the other. And so we see another explosion. The whole war on poverty concept within the Great Society was driven in no small part by federal grants to the states. Medicare, Medicaid, what are those? They are ways to allow the elderly, Medicare, or the poor, Medicaid, to access our health system, which is very expensive. So by 1985, you've gone from $800 million in grants to over $100 billion in grants, a more than about 125-fold increase. And then again today, the last federal budget had over $750 billion in grants. So this system in a century has gone from a kind of smallish exchange, and really smallish if we go back directly 100 years ago, because the Roaring Twenties was almost a reestablishment, at least philosophically, of the Gilded Age, to one where just about 20% of the federal budget is these grants to the states, which is one of the single biggest outlays of money is these grants. The only things ahead of it are Social Security, which I guess you could technically argue is a grant program, but we'll get there, at some point. National defense, and I want to say interest on the debt servicing is right there. Okay? So the next question, maybe the first big question we have to kind of explore, is why does this relationship have to exist? Well, let's look at that. Let's start with why the federal government would like this system, because obviously they're spending a boatload of money. Well, there's three reasons. Reason number one is it gives them constitutional cover to fund programs. Now, in class we talked about how the Constitution assigns certain powers to the federal government. Article 1, Section 8, right? Lays them all out. However, one of the things you'll notice there is not just what's on that list, it's what's not on that list. Taking care of those less fortunate is not anywhere explicitly in the Constitution. Neither is education. Neither is transportation. There's one reference to transportation in the Constitution, one, and it is that Congress will be empowered to build, quote-unquote, postal roads, which presumably means roads that would be passable by horse to deliver the mail. Okay? There's no reference whatsoever to health care or child care. So some of the things we think is the most essential things that government helps people with in the modern era, nowhere to be found in the Constitution. Nowhere. But that's where this system could come in. If the federal government turns, as they've done, let's take Medicaid as an example, because it's the single biggest grant program. Medicaid, for those who do not know, established in the 1960s, gives assistance to those who are below a certain income level to allow them effectively to afford some semblance of health care or health insurance, basically. If I really oversimplified, and it would be a gross oversimplification, it's like health insurance for the poor. Now, nowhere in the Constitution, as I just said, does it say anything about health care as a priority of the federal government. But if they grant money to the states to carry out a program, even if it's a program that the federal government dictates and says, hey, you got to do X, Y, and Z, and here are the thresholds, and here's the amounts you can give out, and here's the care that's accepted, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the federal government can set up every single last rule as long as they're not the ones actually executing the program. Then technically, constitutionally, they're in the clear because it's a state-run program. Now, of course, if the federal government is calling all the shots, then they have a tremendous amount of control over that program. But as long as the actual execution of the policy is done at a state or local level, technically it's a state or local policy with federal funding, which, by the way, happens all the time. Almost every bit of road or highway or freeway construction you've seen in your life has some intermingling of local money, state money, federal money. And the federal money could be the biggest single portion of it. That's entirely possible, in fact. In fact, I'd say in a lot of cases it's probably likely. So, constitutionally, they have cover. Second thing, the federal government doesn't have the debt issues that states do. For one thing, the federal budget's massive. Upwards of, I think it's right around $4 trillion. For another, there's no provision in the Constitution that does not allow the federal government to run a debt. And in fact, it has more often than not, way more often than not, in its recent history, in the last 100 years. Here's why. Because when the government has debt, the way they service that debt is they sell it as an investment. If your parents have treasury bills of some description, what they're basically doing is they finance the federal government's debt. If you have a savings bond at home, all a savings bond is a tiny chunk of the government's debt, and they'll pay you back with interest. They're borrowing money at a decent interest rate for them up front. Now, a lot of state constitutions don't allow the government to run into deficit at all. And even the ones that allow it, it's a lot harder for an individual state to get investors to finance their debt the way the federal government does. The federal government's far bigger, has far more resources, and so investors can look at buying into the federal debt and shrug, whereas buying into the debt of New Hampshire, they might have greater concerns. And that's even if New Hampshire can run a budget deficit, and in fact, I don't actually think they can. And then the third reason why the federal government is okay with this system is it does allow them to exert a certain instrument of control over the states. Now, I'll give you a practical example of that, and one that's not funny, but it's clever. How about that? The practical example is with things like Medicaid and with health care and with welfare, as we call it. The federal government's going to have an interest in making sure that no state is not taking care of their poor. So by running the system from the federal government and just granting the money to the states to execute it, and then they get to set all the rules, they know that a state that may not have a record of being, doing very well by their poor people can't just, take a bunch of money and then abuse it. Or it could be about an instrument of control of trying to get a policy they'd love to get passed, but they don't have the constitutional authority to do so. And that brings me to a pretty good story from my youth, pretty much. So in the 1980s was a decade where a lot of causes came to the forefront. It was a very cause-driven decade. This is the whole We Are the World era and all that, right? For those who don't know what We Are the World is, it was a song. Look it up on Wikipedia. It was pretty amazing, actually. One of the groups that came into vogue during that decade, and I think it was actually founded in the 1960s or 70s, but really came into its own in the 80s, was a group called MADD, M-A-D-D, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Now, they're going to find a way to use the federal government to do their policy bidding. Here's how. First of all, let's be clear on something. The federal government has no authority whatsoever to manage the drinking age. It's go look that one up in the Constitution and see if you can find it anywhere, even something you could sideways reference it as. No, it's just not there. States have the authority to set their own drinking age, and for the longest time they did. California's has been 21 since forever. So is New York's. But Arizona's at one point was 18. And Wyoming was the lowest. It was 16. Presumably on the grounds of, dude, you're in Wyoming. What the hell are you going to hit if you drink and drive? You ran into a butte. I don't know. So, winged a buffalo. I don't know. In about the 80s, it might have been the mid-80s by this point, MADD wanted to see a 21-year drinking age done nationally, because that was the highest state drinking age, was 21. Several states had it, California included. But again, the federal government can't mandate that. But here is what they could do, and they did do. It's not even every year, every couple of years, and I think it's not on a set schedule. It's kind of an as-needed thing, but it's a big deal. There's something called, and I think the full name of it is the Interstate Surface Transportation Expenditure Act. But everyone calls it ICE-T, because it's ISTEA. ICE-T is a giant glob of money that is spent on transportation purposes. Building new roads, refurbishing airports, dredging harbors, repairing bridges and tunnels, the whole 9 yards, mostly building new roads. So we get to the 80s, and at the urging of Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, a congressman puts into the ICE-T bill a provision that if you want to accept the grant money, which ran in, even for the smallest states, ran in the tens or hundreds of millions. If you wanted to accept the ICE-T money, you had to adopt a 21-year drinking age. Now again, federal government's not mandating it. You can say no, but if you say no, you're not eligible to have that money. 50 states in the union, friends. How many of them said no? 0. None of them did. It's not a hard decision. You're the governor of Wyoming. Oh, let my 16-year-olds get shit-faced. $47 million in transportation funding. Sorry, kids. Wait till you're 21 like everybody else. I got money to spend. I mean, it was an easy call. And so that's something the federal government would obviously kind of like, is the ability to dictate state government behavior, because we know that the states govern themselves very, very differently. California governs itself very differently from Texas. Massachusetts governs itself very differently than Florida. So getting all the states to speak with one voice is hard to do, and attractive if you're the federal government sometimes, depending on the issue, of course. So why does the state governments like the system? Well, for one thing, it's hard to turn down free money. Remember, every dollar that they get in grants is a dollar they don't have to tax their citizenry for state taxes. And remember, one of the things that attracts people to certain states is an either low or non-existent state income tax. Nevada, Florida, I think Texas. Now, they have other taxes. Texas actually has a really prohibitive property tax. But the idea of no income tax is awfully, awfully attractive, right? Well, the way that they can do that, the way that Nevada can say, or Texas can say, we're a low-tax state, we don't tax ours, or Florida, is because they get so much money in federal grant money that a lot of the programs they run, they don't pay for. So they'll eat the strings attached, as problematic as they'll be in most cases, because they're going to get the money. Now, it doesn't always happen. There was a big Medicaid expansion under the Obamacare program that a lot of the redder states turned down. We don't want that money because of the conditions that came with it. The second thing is that it puts the debt burden on the federal government. Remember, again, as I said, a lot of these states can't go into debt according to their state constitution, and even the ones that can don't want to. And lastly, it funds programs they'd often want to fund on their own. Healthcare is a good thing to provide your state. Transportation. You want to make sure your workers drive to work without excess traffic on roads that are in excellent condition, etc., etc. Child nutrition is another thing. Okay, so what are the types of financial relationships? Well, let's start with the categorical grant. Now, the categorical grant is by far the most common relationships, financial relationship, the most common grant system. In a categorical grant, when you think categorical, think category, think specific. It's about a thing, right? If something's in a category, it's about that thing, whatever that thing is, that category. Categorical grants are specific. We're going to give you $47 million to renovate Los Angeles International Airport. We're going to give you $127 million to build a new veterans hospital in Orange County. Whatever. States have an obligation to aid some in the funding. But the thing you understand, again, why states are cool with this, the ratios are usually very favorable to the states. So it's like, hey, we're going to put $147 million towards a small hospital, veterans hospital in Orange County. You guys have to come with $3 million. So you're getting a hospital for $3 million. That's not bad. About 90% of the federal money, so that $750 billion we were talking about a minute ago, okay, about 90% of it is done through this method. So what are the two most common examples? Medicaid's the most common example. One that can be very pricey, but thankfully, or we hope, we pray, is not very often, is disaster relief. Disaster relief is a great example of a categorical grant. What happens in a disaster? Things are destroyed. Things are damaged. I'm dating this lecture, which I don't usually want to do because I'm going to use them more than once probably. But just yesterday, this is being recorded in July of 2023, there was a tornado that ripped through the greater Raleigh, North Carolina area, and it ripped through a storage facility for Pfizer pharmaceutical company that had a lot of their injectable like antibiotics and whatnot for hospitals. Did a ton of damage. Almost certainly will create a shortage in those products. Well, they can apply to the federal government for disaster relief and say, hey, we need X number of dollars to repair the facility. We need X number of dollars to rebuild the stock that we lost, et cetera, et cetera. Disaster relief can run into the billions of dollars. I think the biggest single disaster relief package was Hurricane Katrina. I want to say was something like $11 billion just on its own. May have been higher than that, actually. So that's categorical grants. One that is rising, but certainly nowhere near categorical grants, it's up to probably about 8 to 10% of the total grant distribution, is what's called a block grant. Block grants are monies given for a general purpose. So a categorical grant, let's say you're dealing with healthcare. A categorical grant is going to be, here's X number of dollars for a hospital. Here's X number of dollars to provide medicine to less fortunate people in this state. Here is X number of millions of dollars to do immunization and vaccination of incoming students. Here's this, here's that. Block grants is, here's this bigger gob of money for healthcare. You, state government, you figure out how to spend it. Conservatives prefer this. Why? Because most state and local governments tend to be more conservative. Or at least there's a high likelihood that there will be states, the states they care about especially, they'll be more conservative than the federal government, right? For most of the last 30 years, the federal government's been effectively a 50-50 structure, right? Congress has always been within 200 to 250 seats for both parties. The Senate, I think the widest the Senate's gotten was in 2008. It did get to 59-41 Democrat, but since then, I think it's been no more than, I don't think either side's had more than 54 seats. So contrast that with some state legislatures. Almost the entirety of the South have overwhelmingly Republican state legislatures. So obviously, if you are a Republican in Congress, you want as many things done by block grants as possible because you know that you're giving the state authority to do that spending, and they're going to be more prudent if you like it, cheap if you don't, with that funding. So an example of block grants was the Welfare Reform Act in 1996. So in 1996, in the middle of an election year, Republicans do something politically very shrewd. They had just taken control of the House and the Senate, and they passed a welfare reform bill. From the time welfare was established, which was part of the Social Security Act of 1935, welfare had been a federal mandate. That is to say, the federal government actually had been a categorical grant, to be exactly correct. But it was a federal program. So the federal government would set the grants to the states, would tell them exactly what to spend and how much to spend and who to spend it on and everything else. So in 1996, conservatives, knowing it's an election year, knowing Bill Clinton would very much like to get reelected and his poll numbers were not stellar, passed a Welfare Reform Act that turned all that federal money for welfare into a block grant and let every state come up with their own welfare program. Now, at the time, and this is an important phrase to know, at the time, they referred to this as a laboratory of democracy. That was their phrase. Conservatives said this will be great because every state will come up with a welfare plan of their own and they can learn from each other. Maybe Minnesota will see something they like that Wisconsin's doing, and Wisconsin will see something they like that Indiana's doing. And rather than having a one-size-fits-all welfare program, every state can carry out their own agenda and their own program, and you'll have 50 examples to learn from. Sounds good. And in theory, that's quite possibly what could happen. Conservatives loved the idea. Liberals hated it because liberal argument was, well, the whole reason it's a federal program is to make sure that everybody's getting the same thing. Yes, we could have this wonderful laboratory of democracy, but we could just as equally have some states completely underfund their welfare programs because they don't want welfare programs and spend money on other crap instead that is tangentially, very loosely related to welfare. And, both those things happen, to be honest with you. I don't like being a both sides guy. I don't like being a middling guy. But there were some nice reforms, some interesting reforms came out of the states, and then some of them just completely botched their programs and wasted federal money. Both things happen. Okay, there's two other parts of the financial relationship, both fairly small. First one's mandates. Mandates are when money must be spent at a local or state level, I can say words, to comply with existing federal laws. Now, mandates can be funded. That is to say, the feds will help pay for them. But where mandates become controversial is when they're unfunded. And that does happen, where local governments or private individuals, if it's dealing with a business, have to pay the money. Most environmental laws are examples of mandates. They're not the only ones. I'll give you one that's not very far from our classroom. The bridge that connects the two social studies buildings. That's not there because it looks pretty, and it isn't even there for you. It is a mandated structure to comply with something called ADA. And some of you might even know what that is. ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and one of the things that we have angry dogs. One of the things it guaranteed was that all public accommodations, which of course schools are. When we say public accommodations, we mean schools, courthouses, any government building, any building the government paid for, right? Must be accessible to those who have disabilities, physical infirmities, whatever term you want to use. Now, if your building was built before 1990, as long as you make no changes to it, you can be exempt. Of course, buildings don't work like that. Buildings get renovated all the time. So once it's renovated, now you've got to make it what they call ADA compliant. So the building that our classroom's in was built in the late 60s. It was 1967, I believe. But it was renovated in the mid-90s. Because, for one thing, they had to wire it to this newfangled thing called the internet. But also, the buildings were 30, 40 years, almost 40, 35 years old at that point. They just need to be cleaned up. Problem is, when that happened, they have to now be ADA compliant, which means you got to put in an elevator. There's no easy way to add an elevator to an existing building. It's really hard to do. It's actually really expensive. The way that Costa got out of it, by the way, prior to that, if you had a student who was in a wheelchair, you had to literally just take their entire class and put them into a trailer. My senior economics class was in a trailer because one of my friends, who was also named Steve, actually, was wheelchair bound because he had muscular dystrophy. So every other class was in its normal classroom. My economics class was down in one of the trailers, actually kind of down one of the maintenance areas. Well, that wasn't going to fly after the Americans with Disabilities Act, so you're not going to build a elevator in an existing building. You can. It's just expensive, and it's not easy to do. But as it happens, the district was already planning on building a new classroom building, which is the other two-story building. That's relatively new. The one where Getsy and U-Haul and Kofall and Winan and I know I'm forgetting people. I think Kane was in there. I think Olson might be up there. Anyhow, that whole crew. That building's relatively new. It's only been there about 20 years. Actually, I was one of the first occupants of it. When they built that building, they built a bridge. Because that building, as many of you know, does have an elevator. So someone who is disabled can go in the elevator, go up to the floor, and then come across the bridge, come to any classroom. The doorway in our classroom is 3 feet wide. If it was 2 feet 10 inches, they'd have to rebuild it. It has to be at least 3 feet wide to accommodate wheelchair entry. These are mandates. Now, how much did the federal government give us to follow their law? Short answer, nothing, zero, not a dime. Okay? Why is that? Because their conceptualization is, for one thing, there's no way the federal government could pay for every government building to be reaccommodated for people who are disabled. For another, the logic is you're already paying for the renovation. That should just be one of your renovations. And, okay, fair enough. It's not cheap, though. How much does just putting that elevator and that bridge in? I asked my architect wife this, and the number she gave at the time, and again, this was 20 years ago, was probably between $300,000 to $500,000. Okay, that came out of the district's grant money, not grant money, but bond money, and government paid us back none of it. And that's why mandates can be controversial, because you're asking people to do something to comply with the federal law, but you're not giving them any means financially to support that effort. Last but, well, no, actually it is least, is revenue sharing. Now, revenue sharing only did exist for about 13 years. Started in 1973. It was part of something called the New Federalism. It was Nixon's state-centered approach to governing. And what it was a straight-up tax rebate. So the federal government set aside a couple $2 billion and just distributed it to the states according to a mathematical formula they did, and I can't remember the exact particulars of it, but it was basically how big is your state, what's your population, what's your state tax burden, a few other things. They punched the number in the formula, and okay, California, you get $211 million, and Tennessee, you get $19 million, or whatever. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. California would actually probably get a lot more money, actually, so would Tennessee, but that's neither here nor there. Now, the difference between this and all the other grant programs we talked to at this point is there were no strings attached at all. The state government that received that funding could use it for whatever they wanted. So why does it still not exist? Well, the answer is because in 1986, the federal budget deficit had run up to $250 billion a year. Now, the revenue sharing program had never been that kind of money. It was in the small billions. Now, I don't even know if it ever got into double-digit billions. I don't even know if it got over $10 billion. But at a time when the federal government's hemorrhaging money, it's a little cheeky to say that we're just going to kick a bunch of money. It's like saying, yeah, I just filed for bankruptcy. Does anybody need to borrow $20? You know, just didn't seem very practical, so it gets phased out. All right, the final concept goes to this concept that we were just talking about a minute ago, the whole block grant phenomenon, which has been gaining in popularity, which is part of a larger philosophical movement known as devolution. Devolution is defined as the movement of financial or policy authority on these kind of grant programs from the federal government down to other layers of government. It doesn't actually have to be government. I'll get to that in a second. So we have three types of devolution. First order devolution is federal government to the states. Welfare. is a great example of that, right? So instead of the federal government naming all the rules for how welfare eligibility is and everything else, now each individual state gets to make their own rules and their own procedures. They still get the money, but now that policy financial authority is in the hands of the states. That's first order devolution. Second order devolution is going from the federal government down to the city and county level. An example of this, and they happen periodically, they don't happen every year, would be any kind of what we call crime bill. A crime bill is when the federal government devotes a large sum of money to assist in fighting crime across the country. Well, criminal justice matters are one of the most localized things in terms of power. Most police forces are city-based, community-based, at most county-based, right? There are state police departments, but most policing is done at the local level. So when you get crime bills, generally that money, if it's being done via block grant, which the last one was, by the way, it's LA County Sheriff's Department gets X number of dollars, and they're the ones that decide how to spend it, not the federal government. Up till this point, crime legislation like that, the purse strings were held by the federal government. So they would give, say, $33 million to the LA County Sheriff's Department, but they would also say, you should spend $4 million on this, $2.6 million on that, $3 million on... It was laid out specifically. Categorical grants. Categorical, specific. Block grants, general. So in a block grant situation, the LA County Sheriff's Department gets the same $33 million, but now it's LA County Sheriff's Department's determination of what should and should not be done. Third order devolution is devolution that is the federal government down to private organizations, businesses, churches. An example of this would be something that actually got tested in court in the 2000s. President Bush's, what he called his faith-based initiative, which was in the name of fighting poverty. It devoted funds, pretty fair amount, to religious-run institutions that also do charitable or social work. For example, a lot of shelters are run by religious institutions, churches or community religious groups or what have you. Same thing with like meal places, soup kitchens, and things like that. So the idea of the faith-based initiative was, the argument Bush made is, it just so happens that some of the people running the best programs of this type happen to be private. They are churches, they're private businesses, private organizations like the Los Angeles Mission or the Union Rescue Mission. Let's put money into their hands and let them determine how to fund the programs they've already done so well. Now, of course, in the case of the church-based stuff, there was a First Amendment question, which is, do Jewish taxpayers, in the name of freedom of religion, really have to fund government money to, say, Catholic churches in their community who are doing soup kitchens? Now, it's worth noting, just to take a quick aside here, the federal government already talked about that. The courts had already talked about that in 1971 in a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. And there, the question, the answer the court gave at the time was, as long as the purpose of the money is non-religious and is not spent with a religious objective in mind, it was completely constitutional. Now, where that's become an issue even to this current day is, well, let's say, for example, the government gives money to the Salvation Army to run soup kitchens. Well, the Salvation Army, being a religious organization, at last I checked, and this may have changed, has a non-hiring policy as it relates to LGBT people. So does that create a constitutional issue? So of the three orders of devolution, third order devolution is by far and away the most controversial. Because even the ones that don't deal with First Amendment implications on freedom of religion, you're still having the federal government giving money to private businesses or private enterprises. So in the modern era, we've seen examples of this in two ways. One is the growth of block grants. You only had 4 in 1980, you had 24 by the year 2000, in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Or not hundreds, I'm sorry, in the tens of billions of dollars, my bad. The second thing was the federal government passing laws to allow states to waive out of categorical programs like Medicaid. So the thing you got to know, the thing you got to understand is that this is relatively new. And it is definitely a tilting in this long question over who gets to make these decisions in the direction of the states. Letting states wave their way out of categorical grant programs is a pretty uncommon thing. Now, there have been real impacts of devolution, particularly as it relates to the poor. A lot, welfare is devolved now; it's a state program. A lot of the groups that deal with the impoverished have been given federal money, but whether they're private institutions through third order devolution or the states through first order devolution, as it relates to what's called now TANF, Temporary Aid to Needy Families, that big government program, the decision making is no longer done by the federal government. The policies are all established at that localized level. That being said, during that time, the number of and dollar value of categorical grants has continued to increase. So it's not necessarily a replacement, it's more of an add-on, if that makes sense. Okay, financial federalism is done, and actually federalism is pretty damn close to done, and so is unit number 1. Next on deck, once we get this unit in the books, is going to be the actual institutions of American government. We're going to look at Congress, President, and the like. But for now, federalism is just about this far. My fingers are a couple inches apart from being in the books, and today's notes are very much in the books. Till next time, adios, vaya con Dios, and all that.